faction. You know, I don't really know if like aggressively pro-China Chinese people are really that involved in our politics. In fact, I've heard it said that Chinese people are actually quite disengaged from Vancouver politics, proportionate to their share of the population here. They are an important voting bloc, but again, I don't know if it really goes without saying that their political preferences are for Chinese-style communism. All right, next to the Vancouverite, we have the old guard NDP. And he is saying, I don't care about multiculturalism, we need more social programs. And in the back, there is a sign that says Tommy. So the NDP is the New Democratic Party of Canada, in theory, the furthest left of the mainstream Canadian parties. Tommy is a reference to Tommy Douglas, who was the most iconic leader of the NDP during the 1960s. He is considered the founding father of the Canadian Medicare regime. So I guess this guy is supposed to be a kind of old-fashioned NDPer who is very loyal to the kind of Tommy Douglas vision of what the NDP is for, which is the creation of new social programs like Medicare. You know, it's a common critique to sort of say that kind of the modern left, and this would include the NDP, has sort of drifted too far from the kind of social programs sort of centric vision of government and towards, you know, what we would call the kind of more woke identity politics sort of thing. You know, it's why the guy is saying, I don't care about multiculturalism, we need more social programs. You know, this is a kind of idea that the NDP has sort of lost its way and needs to get back to sort of the core principles of Tommy Douglas. Some would say, you know, a kind of more orthodox socialist view of government. Again, like the Vancouverite, I don't know if this is really that prominent a faction of Canadian politics these days. Canadian political parties don't really allow a lot of dissent within their ranks, so the idea that there is a faction of the NDP that is critical of the path that the NDP is currently on is kind of, eh. All right, next to that guy, we have the Sam Steele, and he is saying, revolution? No, just peace, order, and good government. And he's got a flag that says HBC. So Sam Steele is a man from the 19th century who was associated with sort of the founding of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties of popular lore. In the contemporary Canadian imagination, he is sort of understood to have been this very sort of like upright, law and order, very justice-focused, principled man. When he's saying revolution, no, just peace, order, and good government, you know, that's kind of a reference to this certain, I'd say quite 19th century idea of what Canada is supposed to be, you know, a country that rejects the American Revolution and instead embraces the cause of peace, order, and good government rather than life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Peace, order, and good government is a line from the Canadian Constitution that sort of explains what the government of Canada is for. You know, I don't know if this is a political faction, but I do think that this kind of like romantic idea of Canada as a sort of law and order peaceful alternative to the US is certainly very prevalent in modern Canadian politics. The flag he has, by the way, the HBC flag, that's a reference to the Hudson's Bay Company, which was this sort of fur trading corporation that controlled much of the lands of Canada back in the back until the late 19th century. All right, and then next we have the revanchist. And he is saying, we would be the biggest superpower in the world right now if we hadn't canceled the Avro Arrow. So a revanchist is someone who kind of looks backwards and wants to reclaim the glories of the past. This character in particular is kind of an allusion to this idea that Canada was poised for greatness after the Second World War and sort of the aftermath of all of that, and that we kind of blew that opportunity, or that powerful forces, which is to say the United States, conspired to like weaken Canada and prevent it from sort of achieving its destiny. So the Avro Arrow was a jet that was designed by Canada in, I believe, the late 1950s. And, you know, it was supposed to be top of the line, you know, the best jet in the world, supersonic and, you know, revolutionary and all this kind of thing. But the project was canceled and all of the jets were destroyed. And this kind of tale of woe has become very sort of sentimentalized by a certain kind of, yes, I would say sort of revanchist Canadian, as sort of like the moment in which sort of Canada blew its potential to be more powerful than it was. Prime Minister Diefenbaker was the one who canceled it, and you know, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about why he canceled it. You know, was he forced to by jealous Americans who didn't want Canada to become a superpower? I think more mainstream historians would say it was canceled for much more mundane reasons. You know, the technology wasn't actually that great and it was very over budget and this sort of thing. But it is, again, like a symbol of, yes, a kind of revanchist sort of fantasy of what Canada could have been. And I would say that nostalgic people of that sort still are present to some degree in Canadian politics. All right, and now we have the imperialist who says, the Arctic is Canada, Denmark, get out. This is certainly a faction I do think you see in modern Canada. You know, imperialism has always been part of Canada's history, whether it's the territory of North America that we annexed or, you know, these kind of ongoing fantasies that we must sort of continue to expand our borders and absorb new territory even now. Even in mainstream Canadian newspapers, you sometimes see these preposterous editorials talking about what Canada should annex next. I've seen them suggest everything from Haiti to Scotland, but it is the Arctic that is really sort of the subject of fascination of this kind of set. You know, if you look at a map of Canada, there's these huge sort of islands in the north, and Canada's sort of ability to control the land and, more importantly, like the waters around those lands is very much sort of contested, I think, by a lot of the world. There is this very sort of notorious episode in modern Canadian history where the government of Denmark via Greenland was contesting Canada's claim to like this sort of useless rock in the Arctic that was sort of seen to be in their territorial waters, but, you know, Canada contested that and said, no, it's in our territorial waters, and this became a sort of subject of great media fascination because it was so ridiculous. But then you did have some people that like took it very seriously and sort of said like, no, these other countries are encroaching upon sovereign Canadian territory. Canada must defend the Arctic from foreign invaders. We conquered it first, you know, this kind of thing. In contrast to those who say that the waters in the Canadian North should perhaps be internationalized, you know, the imperialist would kind of say like, no, we must like spend a lot of money building icebreakers and militarizing that northern territory in order to prevent the foreigners from coming in. All right, and now we have the monarchist who is saying, abolish parliament, direct rule by Lizzie. He is dressed in the uniform of a British soldier. I think it's specifically supposed to be a soldier from the 1812 war, which was of course the war between the United States and Britain to keep Canada British. At least that's how Canada remembers it. And a Canadian monarchist is basically somebody who is very loyal even now. You know, this character is flying the what is called the Red Ensign, which is the old pre-1965 flag of Canada that still had the Union Jack on it. The government got rid of that flag because it was seen as anachronistic. You know, it sort of was a flag of Canada when Canada was a colony, which by 1965 it obviously wasn't. But you still have people that are sort of sentimental about that because they miss the colonial days in some ways. You know, the British Empire is very romantic and people romanticize it, and they romanticize, you know, the royal family and the monarchy and all of this sort of thing. And, you know, that's basically what a monarchist is into. Monarchism in Canada is a very aesthetic thing. You know, it's not a political ideology. The fact that this character is saying, abolish parliament, direct rule by Lizzie, you know, I think that's more kind of just making fun of how sort of watered down Canadian monarchism is. You know, there is really no faction in Canada that is arguing for the British monarchy to actually exercise more control over Canada. It's mostly just a kind of sentimentality about our British past and then sort of the manifestations of the British connection that remain today, such as, you know, the royal family and Canada's constitutional links to it. All right, and now we have the true socialist. He is dressed like some sort of Maoist, and he is saying, just because you have welfare doesn't make it socialism. You have to seize the means of production. So, like, I guess Canada is sometimes kind of lazily called a socialist country, you know, by right-wingers in this country and the US. And then this guy is kind of pushing against that and saying like, no, we're not actually a socialist country. You have to seize the means of production. You know, you have to basically have literal communism before you can claim that title. I don't really know if Canada has that many true socialists present in our politics today. Socialism, in an orthodox sense, has been historically very unpopular in Canada. Even the NDP, which, you know, some people think of as a socialist party, has been historically kind of shy about using that term for themselves. And speaking of the NDP, next door we have the Dipper, and he is saying, just give us one government, you give the other guys so many. So Dipper is a kind of very old-fashioned nickname for a member of the NDP. So I guess like this guy's just supposed to represent kind of your base NDP supporter. And this guy is crying because what he's saying is true. In all of Canadian history, there has never been an NDP prime minister. There have only been conservative prime ministers and liberal prime ministers. The NDP has been trying to win power for I don't know how many decades now, and they've never come remotely close. It is kind of remarkable that they keep trying. All right, and next to the Dipper, we have the Grit, and he is saying, possibly to the Dipper, we're the natural governing party. You didn't know that? Grit is an old-fashioned nickname for a member of the Liberal Party of Canada. One of the self-flattering nicknames that the Liberal Party has given itself over the years is the Natural Governing Party. This refers to the fact that when you look at the, you know, the tenures of the different Canadian prime ministers, most of them, or at least the ones that have reigned the longest, have all been liberals. So the argument would be that in Canada, the natural order of things is to always have a liberal prime minister, except in like exceptional circumstances where once in a while you'll have a conservative sort of breaking it up a bit. All right, so next to the